I've worked my entire life, quietly, consistently, without applause. So when my son invited me to dinner with his wife's wealthy parents, I didn't expect praise. I expected courtesy. Instead, I became the punchline. At the table, crystal glasses clinking, his father-in-law asked about my career. Before I could answer, my son smiled and said I was between jobs. His wife laughed and added, probably forever. Everyone joined in, and I laughed too. Not because it was funny, but because they had no idea what I had just signed that morning. They didn't know the inheritance papers were finalized. They didn't know the acquisition documents were already filed. They didn't know the company they bragged about owning now belonged to me. I finished my meal politely. I said goodnight. The next morning, my phone rang. My son's voice was shaking. Mom, please don't do this. My name is Helena Crow, and I am 59 years old. I raised my son with discipline, values, and the belief that dignity matters more than appearances. When he invited me to dinner with his wife's parents, he said it was important that they wanted to really know me. I chose a simple dress, nothing flashy, nothing apologetic. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I had survived decades of work, sacrifice, and quiet responsibility. Still, as I walked into that elegant dining room, I felt the shift immediately. The glances lingered too long. Smiles were polite but measured. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't there to prove anything. I was there because he was my son, and because family, I believed, still meant something. The dinner invitation came wrapped in careful words and rehearsed enthusiasm. My son said his in-laws were curious about me, which already felt strange. Curious about what exactly? My life wasn't a mystery. Still, I agreed, reminding myself that this was about harmony, not pride. When I arrived, their home felt more like a showroom than a place where people lived. Everything sparkled, but nothing felt warm. I was introduced with a brief pause, my name said without context, as if my story didn't matter enough to explain. I noticed how questions weren't asked directly to me, but around me, as though I were a subject being evaluated. Wasn't hostile, just quietly dismissive. And somehow that made it worse. As we sat down, I became aware of how closely I was being observed. The mother-in-law scanned my clothes, my posture, even how I held my glass. The father asked polite questions that felt more like checkpoints than curiosity. I answered calmly, offering nothing extra, nothing defensive. My daughter-in-law smiled often, but her eyes stayed cold. She leaned into my son, whispering things that made him nod before glancing at me. It was clear they had already decided who I was before I spoke. No one asked about my past or my experiences. Instead, the conversation hovered around wealth, investments, and achievements I wasn't invited into. I realized then that this dinner wasn't about connection, it was about classification. The moment came suddenly, disguised as casual conversation. The father-in-law asked my son what I used to do, emphasizing the past tense. I opened my mouth to answer, ready to speak for myself, but my son beat me to it. He smiled, the same smile he used when trying to smooth things over, and said I was between jobs. The words landed heavier than expected, not because they were untrue, but because they were incomplete and dismissive. I felt every eye shift toward me, assessing, recalculating. No one asked for clarification. No one gave me the chance to explain. At that moment, my entire life was reduced to a temporary inconvenience, and the silence that followed made it clear they were comfortable with that version of me. Before I could respond, my daughter-in-law laughed softly and added, probably forever. The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind meant to sound harmless but cut deeply. My son didn't correct her. He didn't defend me. He chuckled along as if this were normal, as if I deserved it. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from embarrassment but from betrayal. This wasn't strangers mocking me. This was family, people who benefited from my support, my time, my silence. I looked around the table and realized no one saw me as a person anymore. I was a label, a joke, a warning of what not to become. And in that moment, I made a quiet decision I would not announce aloud. The laughter lingered longer than necessary, filling the room with something sharp and hollow. Glasses clinked. Someone changed the subject. Life moved on except for me. I noticed how easily they dismissed what they had done, how quickly they returned to comfort once the joke was made. My son avoided my eyes. My daughter-in-law looked satisfied. I realized they expected me to shrink, to defend myself, or to feel ashamed. Instead, I smiled. Not a forced smile, but a controlled one. I laughed lightly, just enough to blend in. That seemed to surprise them. They assumed my laughter meant acceptance. What it really meant was restraint, because sometimes the strongest response is not immediate, it's intentional. I finished my meal calmly, thanked them for dinner, and excused myself early. No confrontation, no explanations. I didn't correct the lie or challenge the insult. I knew anything I said would be twisted or dismissed. Silence in that moment was not weakness, it was strategy. As I walked out, I felt lighter than expected. They believed they had won something. They believed I had been put in my place. What they didn't know was that silence gave me clarity. I saw exactly how they viewed me and, more importantly, how little they valued me. That understanding didn't hurt, it focused me. And as I drove home, I knew one thing with certainty. The next time my phone rang, the balance of power would be very different. That morning, before stepping into the trap of polite humiliation, the inheritance papers were finalized. I had quietly executed every detail, ensuring that no one would notice until it was too late. The house, the assets, and the millions I never flaunted were legally mine now. Holding the documents in my hands, I felt a strange thrill, power wrapped in silence. I smiled to myself, imagining the dinner later that evening, not with anger but with anticipation. They had no idea the woman they dismissed was no longer powerless. I carried that knowledge with calm determination. The timing was perfect. While they believed they controlled the narrative, the reality had already shifted, quietly but permanently, in my favor. For the first time, I understood what it felt like to be untouchable without making a sound. Years of labor and sacrifice had led me here, and I remembered them vividly. Late nights working multiple jobs, weekends spent running errands and paying bills, time devoted to nurturing my son without recognition. I had lived quietly, generously, and consistently, and no one had ever truly acknowledged it. They had assumed my diligence and patience were endless, that my presence came without expectation. Every sleepless night and every unclaimed achievement now compounded into a quiet strength. I realized that my consistency had been invisible to those who didn't care to notice, yet it had given me the means to act decisively. The irony was delicious. Those who laughed at me that night were about to discover that the woman they belittled held the keys to their comfort, and it wasn't temporary. I made a conscious decision years ago: invest, don't announce. While others flaunted wealth or status, I built quietly, methodically, and with patience. Stocks, real estate, and businesses I understood, all accumulated without a word to anyone, least of all family. I never needed approval, applause, or recognition. Today, that strategy paid off spectacularly. As my son and his wife plotted their jokes and gossiped at the table, they remained completely unaware that their world had already changed. What they perceived as weakness or irrelevance was actually calculated restraint. I had waited, watched, and ensured the timing was right. Tonight, silence would be my ally, and the truth, unexpected, undeniable, irreversible, would speak louder than any outburst could. Weeks of research and casual inquiries had revealed a truth no one ever suspected. The in-laws depended heavily on the company they bragged about. They boasted of ownership, wealth, and influence, yet their lives relied on the assets and management they didn't fully control. I knew the numbers, the debts, the hidden vulnerabilities. They had no idea that the woman they deemed unimportant could, in a single move, control the flow of their wealth. The knowledge was intoxicating, not for revenge but for the security it gave me. Power often hides behind arrogance, and I held the key. Walking into dinner, I felt the thrill of anticipation, knowing the imbalance would soon become glaringly clear. Acquiring the company had been a delicate dance, requiring precision, timing, and discretion. Every signature, every transfer, every confidential meeting had been executed with the utmost care. No leaks, no hints, no chance of premature discovery. I had learned the rules of the business world long ago. Patience, silence, and careful observation create an unshakable advantage. Now the transaction is complete. The assets, the decisions, the authority, everything had shifted without public announcement. I could see it in my mind, their laughter at dinner, oblivious to the reality that the empire they assumed belonged to them had silently passed into my control. It was exquisite. Not vindictive, not malicious, but inevitable. The weight of that knowledge gave me an unspoken satisfaction I had never experienced before. I signed the final documents in my home office, alone and calm. No celebratory phone calls, no announcements. Just the faint scratching of my pen against paper, each signature sealing their ignorance. Every line, every clause ensured the ownership was legally indisputable. Silence was intentional, secrecy was a weapon. When I closed the folder, I felt the power settle in my chest, steady and real. I didn't need validation from anyone, not even from my son. They had underestimated me. Their assumptions about my status, my worth, and my influence had blinded them to reality. The quiet strength I had nurtured for decades was ready to reveal itself. For now, the world outside my office believed I was still between jobs, but very soon, that illusion would shatter. That evening, I walked into the dining room with the poise of someone who knew exactly how the night would unfold. I carried nothing but my calm and my awareness, yet everything had already shifted in my favor. While they laughed and whispered assumptions about my unemployment, I held the invisible weight of ownership over the very company that defined their status. Each step, each gesture, each polite smile reinforced my presence without alerting them to the truth. They were confident in their superiority, completely unaware that the balance had quietly tipped. The irony was delicious. I sat down at the table, let the conversation flow around me, and listened. Tonight, silence wasn't weakness, it was power. And they were about to realize it, though they didn't yet know how. I laughed along with the table, the polite, soft laughter that blended into the room without drawing attention. Every chuckle from my daughter-in-law and her parents seemed to hit harder than the last, yet I let it roll over me. The key was patience, letting them feel in control while I remained quietly untouchable. I didn't interrupt, didn't defend, and didn't explain myself. Their laughter was empty, but my calm smile carried weight they couldn't sense. Inside, I held the knowledge that the balance had already shifted. Ownership, power, and control were quietly mine. Every joke, every whisper, every amused glance confirmed how deeply they underestimated me. And I let them believe they had won, all the while knowing the game had changed long before the first laugh was spoken. I noticed my son's behavior closely, the way he sat back, comfortably watching me become the subject of ridicule. His laughter was easy, casual, as if the entire humiliation was nothing more than entertainment. I felt a pang, not of hurt, but of clarity. This wasn't merely about my daughter-in-law's arrogance, it was about his complacency. He had learned to enjoy my discomfort, to laugh at my supposed irrelevance. And yet, that very complacency gave me an advantage. While he thought he was witnessing weakness, I was observing patterns, reactions, and assumptions. Every chuckle, every nod, every glance became data, evidence of entitlement and ignorance. I held it all in, storing the insight for the moment when silence would speak louder than confrontation ever could. Her smugness was palpable, radiating from her posture, her voice, the tiny gestures she made while explaining my shortcomings. She leaned forward, expecting agreement from her parents, certain that I could not rebut her. Every word carried pride, superiority, and a deep confidence in her own cleverness. I watched without flinching. I did not raise an eyebrow, did not frown, did not let a single emotion betray the storm building inside me. Her arrogance was a shield, but it also made her predictable. She assumed I would react, that I would be embarrassed, that I would lose composure. But I had learned long ago that patience and observation often accomplish more than outbursts ever could. Her sense of superiority would be her undoing, though she could not yet see it. I focused intently on every word spoken at the table, the small inflections, the pauses, and the barely audible whispers. Each syllable revealed intent, expectation, and entitlement. I listened not to reply, but to understand, to map the hierarchy of arrogance and dependence. It became clear how deeply they assumed my silence meant compliance, that my presence existed solely to absorb ridicule. Each laugh and joke confirmed patterns I had already anticipated. I remained calm, allowing them to talk themselves into overconfidence. While they believed control was theirs, I was quietly shaping the moment in my mind. Observation became my strategy, and every small detail they revealed would inform the perfect timing for the truth to arrive, irrevocably and without warning. When I finally stood, I did so with poise and deliberate calm. I thanked them quietly for the meal, smiled, and walked toward the door without a word of confrontation. Every step was measured, every gesture serene. They didn't expect this. They expected tears, retorts, or embarrassment. Instead, I offered quiet dignity, leaving them in the uncomfortable balance between arrogance and realization. The sound of my shoes against the floor seemed louder than the laughter I left behind. I felt no anger, only control. I didn't need to assert my authority verbally. My composure spoke volumes. Their assumptions about power, relevance, and obedience were beginning to crack simply because I refused to participate in their narrative. Once outside, I breathed deeply, letting the cool air wash over me. I didn't replay insults in my mind. I didn't plot revenge or corrections. I had learned that responding immediately often feeds arrogance, while strategic silence undermines it. I remained detached yet aware, letting them stew in the belief that they had diminished me. The contrast between their assumptions and reality became my quiet advantage. I had already taken action, legally, financially, and strategically, but I waited for the moment when understanding would strike. The restraint was deliberate. Power often whispers rather than shouts, and I had mastered the art of the whisper. Driving home, I felt a strange calm. Their laughter, the humiliation, the casual dismissal, it all existed in a bubble that would soon burst. I knew reality would arrive not through confrontation, but through consequence. My son and his wife had no idea the world had quietly shifted beneath their assumptions. Their confidence, entitlement, and arrogance were all on display, yet completely irrelevant to the truth I now held. I waited with patience, allowing the invisible balance to tilt further in my favor. The anticipation was controlled, deliberate. I had learned that timing, silence, and observation often achieve more than immediate action. Tonight there was a rehearsal. Tomorrow they would see it, whether they were ready or not. The phone rang early the next morning, its tone sharp against the quiet of my kitchen. I saw my son's name flash across the screen and felt a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. I let it ring a moment longer than usual before answering, savoring the weight of the silence. When I picked up, his voice was immediate, tight, and hurried, a stark contrast to his composed demeanor the night before. There was no greeting, only rapid fire words, and I listened without interrupting. The tension in his tone told me everything I needed to know. The laughter from last night had left an echo, and for the first time, he realized he might have underestimated me. I remained silent, allowing the gravity of my calm to fill the space between us. As he spoke, the arrogance that had guided him at dinner was gone. His voice cracked, faltering as fear seeped in. He stammered, trying to explain the situation, stumbling over phrases about deadlines, missed payments, and impending consequences. The confident laughter he had shared with his wife only hours before now felt hollow in memory. I didn't rush to reassure him or fill the silence. Instead, I let him realize the seriousness of the moment himself. Every word he uttered betrayed panic and dependence. I could hear him searching for solutions, for some lifeline he had always assumed I would provide. The balance had shifted entirely, and the fear in his tone was evidence that power had quietly returned to its rightful place, my hands. It became clear quickly that he had discovered something had shifted, though he didn't yet know the extent. He mentioned figures, company names, and assets in fragmented, panicked sentences. Each phrase confirmed my success at keeping the acquisition secret. He hadn't anticipated that the person he had dismissed and mocked could act decisively without notice. His questions became urgent, seeking confirmation, reassurance, or explanations that I wasn't ready to provide. The realization on his end was palpable, the panic growing as he tried to grasp the change. He was facing consequences he hadn't imagined, and I held the knowledge calmly, knowing the advantage was mine. Observation and silence were my allies, letting him unravel while I stayed firmly grounded in clarity. I could hear her voice in the background, sharp and frantic, whispering instructions, clarifying, demanding. She had quickly realized the shift and tried to regain control. Her confidence was replaced by desperation. Every question she posed was hurried, frantic, and defensive. She attempted to steer the conversation back to familiar territory, to regain the assumed control she had exercised over dinner, but the dynamics had changed. I remained calm and silent, letting her frustration build. The panic in her tone underscored the power of patience and quiet strategy. She had relied on assumptions, entitlement, and habit, and now, those assumptions were crumbling. Listening to her panic without interjecting reinforced the invisible weight of authority I carried, a weight they could neither dismiss nor counter. Through fractured sentences and hurried explanations, I could hear pleading but no apology. Requests for leniency, promises of repayment, and assurances of change tumbled out of their mouths, desperate yet hollow. My son begged in clipped, anxious tones, and my daughter-in-law's whispers urged concessions. I remained unmoved, silent, letting them expose their own dependence. Every word they spoke confirmed the imbalance of power. The words were not respectful, they were demanding, urgent, and self-serving, but I didn't respond immediately. Patience amplified the impact of their own pleas. The weight of their desperation, combined with the absence of my usual compliance, revealed the truth they had ignored for years. They had underestimated me. I remained silent, a deliberate choice. My quiet became more potent than any argument or scolding could have been. The pauses I allowed between their sentences made them doubt themselves, question assumptions, and realize that their control was gone. My inaction became a statement of authority, signaling that I was no longer a participant in their narrative, only an observer with absolute discretion. The tension grew palpable, filling the call with uncertainty and unease. They had expected compliance, reassurance, and immediate solutions, but none came. The realization that silence could hold such weight was almost tangible, and for the first time, they felt the vulnerability of depending on someone they had dismissed and underestimated. I inhaled deeply, weighing my next words. Nothing rushed me, nothing compelled me to act hastily. This was the culmination of years of observation, restraint, and quiet preparation. I understood the moment's gravity. What I said next would permanently alter expectations and relationships. I didn't need to raise my voice, argue, or justify myself. Every option I had could be measured, deliberate, and intentional. I held the balance entirely in my hands, ready to respond in a way that reflected self-respect, authority, and quiet power. The tension on the other end of the line was almost tangible, and I smiled softly to myself, knowing that the story was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to me. Don't scroll away, like and subscribe, because the moment that follows will shock everyone. I spoke calmly into the phone, laying out the facts without emotion. Ownership of the company had legally passed to me, and any previous assumptions about control were no longer valid. I didn't shout, I didn't lecture, but every word carried clarity and certainty. My son's voice wavered as he tried to interrupt, to soften the impact, but I didn't allow it. The silence between my statements amplified the truth more than anger ever could. This was not revenge, it was recognition of my value and authority. Every clause, every point I made reminded them that I was no longer invisible, no longer assumed powerless. By the end of the call, it was unmistakable. The reality had shifted permanently, and they had to accept it. I explained that family ties didn't equate to entitlement. Just because they were related didn't mean access to resources, decisions, or influence was guaranteed. My tone remained even, controlled, almost gentle, yet it carried the weight of finality. I highlighted the difference between respect earned and privilege assumed, emphasizing that prior dismissals and jokes could no longer dictate boundaries. Their initial confusion was evident, replaced gradually by fear and awkward acknowledgement. They were hearing a side of me they had never truly considered, a woman who understood value, leverage, and limits. No pleading, no threats, no anger, just clarity. I wanted them to understand that love or family connections didn't erase accountability, and from now on, every interaction would be measured and deliberate. I made it clear that informal access, favors, or assumptions about intervention would end immediately. No more phone calls for shortcuts, no more casual requests disguised as conversation. The tools they had relied on to control situations were gone, replaced by structure, legality, and boundaries. I didn't justify, negotiate, or debate. Silence filled the spaces where arguments might have erupted. Each word I spoke reinforced that the dynamic had changed. They could no longer presume compliance or obedience. Their previous sense of superiority dissolved in real time. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in punishing them, but in reclaiming authority over what was mine. The shift was subtle yet undeniable, and it would guide every interaction moving forward. By the middle of the conversation, my son's tone shifted from panic to comprehension. He understood slowly that every assumption he had made about me, about my willingness to fix things, was no longer valid. His voice was smaller, careful, cautious. Questions that had once carried expectations now sounded like pleading. The humor and casual dismissal that had dominated our past interactions had vanished completely. I didn't offer reassurance. I simply held my ground, letting him absorb the reality of what his inattention and entitlement had caused. For the first time, he saw me as an individual with agency, not as a backup for convenience. The recognition was slow, painful for him, but necessary, a lesson embedded in consequence rather than confrontation. I could hear my daughter-in-law's frustration and disbelief on the other end. The authority she had assumed, her casual arrogance, even the power she wielded with a whispered threat had evaporated. Every phrase she tried to assert fell flat, undermined by the clarity and legality of my statements. Her voice grew sharper, but each word only emphasized her helplessness. She had counted on fear, manipulation, and inherited patterns of compliance. None of it worked now. The control she believed she held was entirely imaginary. I remained steady, letting her unravel in recognition of a truth she could neither challenge nor reverse. The realization hit her with full force. Her leverage had vanished, and nothing in her previous behavior could retrieve it. Apologies, compliments, and sudden deference began to emerge, awkward and belated. They spoke more carefully now, realizing the woman they had mocked was not only capable but untouchable within the structures she now controlled. Respect, long ignored, finally arrived, but it felt hollow, forced, and overdue. I didn't accept praise or gratitude. I listened without reacting, understanding that recognition earned after humiliation was not genuine respect. My calm, measured response emphasized that they were too late, the power had already shifted. What they once dismissed as weakness now radiated authority, and it was unmistakable that the rules had changed permanently. Their words could not erase years of assumption, nor could they regain the balance they had lost. Once the call ended, I sat in silence, letting the adrenaline fade. No celebration, no gloating, just peace. I didn't need their approval or acknowledgement to validate my actions. For years, I had acted for others' comfort, silently absorbing disrespect. Now I acted for myself. Every choice, every boundary, and every word had been deliberate. The freedom was subtle but profound. No longer responsible for entitlement, no longer subject to assumptions, no longer diminished by disregard. Peace replaced the tension, and clarity replaced the expectation of approval. I understood that power, quiet and deliberate, could protect dignity better than confrontation ever would. Finally, I felt a weight lift, knowing that self-respect had become my guiding force, and nothing could take it away.